This is our first presentation for surveys. In this presentation, we will review the general features of surveys and discuss variations in survey design and survey modes, or how data is collected. Survey research asks a sample of people a predetermined set of questions in order to estimate characteristics of the population. You likely know what surveys are. Examples include email requests to participate in an online survey, customer call center requests to participate in a survey at the end of the call, and even U.S. Census Bureau questionnaires. Even if you've never completed a survey, you've likely seen results of survey research in news headlines. Before we move on, let's discuss the example study presented in the text. This gives us an idea of the format of the data that survey research provides. The Constructing the Family survey asked a core research question: what living arrangements do Americans count as a family? The survey was conducted over the telephone, and they randomly selected 712 respondents in 2003. This connects to previous chapters, as these 712 respondents are a representative sample of the U.S. population. The survey asked a variety of questions, including questions related to the main research question of what counts as a family. But it also asked additional questions on social attitudes and behaviors, such as attitudes towards gay men and lesbians, marital name changes, relative importance of biological and social factors in child's development, and so on. And lastly, it also included important demographic questions or background questions, such as age, education, gender, race, religion, marital status, and so on. Why would the survey ask these three types of questions and not just the first one about what counts as a family? By having this information, researchers can look for a causal relationship between variables. For example, is a very religious person more likely to conform to traditional ideas of the family compared to one who is more liberal in their religion? Or age. Does age have an effect on how one defines a family? We'll return to this later in the presentation. But first, let's look at how the sample, the participants, defined families. So this table over here tells us the percentage of Americans who identify a family according to the different living arrangements listed here. So the percentage of Americans who believe that a husband and wife living together with one or more children is a family, the very top row, all the way down to the two people living together as housemates, asking whether that counts as a family. In the next slide, I'm going to pose a number of questions related to this table. So you can pause the presentation and return to this section to review the table for the answers. The first question asks, what types of living arrangements count as a family according to most Americans? So we'll define this as greater than 90%. So if 90% or more respondents labeled this particular living arrangement as a family. The second question asks, whose opinion is this table representing? Pause the presentation while you consider the answers to these questions. Let's return to the presentation and take a look at the answers. So for the first question, what types of living arrangements count as a family according to most Americans? So most Americans, 90% or more, define a family as requiring the presence of children at home and or a legal heterosexual relationship. For the second question, whose opinion is this table representing? This table represents the U.S. population. While the survey was asked of 712 respondents, they were a sample of the U.S. population. So findings from this study are generalizable to the U.S. population. So because the survey used probability sampling, the responses from the respondents, we can assume that that is the same as the U.S. population. Now that we have seen an example of a survey research study, let's review the 3 general research features of a survey. First, it relies on large-scale probability sampling. So remember, that means random sampling. So national opinion polls typically have around 1,000 respondents in order to be representative of the U.S. population or to be generalizable. We learned the importance of generalizability in the previous chapter on sampling. Surveys also rely on structured questionnaires. Surveys tend to follow standardized procedures for asking questions. This means that the same questions are asked of everyone, and they are asked usually in the same order. Questions are almost always closed-ended, meaning that an option of answers are provided for respondents. We'll review the different types of questions in the next presentation. Here are 2 tables. We've already seen Table 8.1 at the top. Table 8.2 at the bottom describes how people define families depending on whether or not they have gay friends or relatives. Which of these tables is a descriptive analysis and which is an explanatory analysis? Remember that the descriptive analysis provides characteristics of a population, while the explanatory analysis investigates relationships between 2 or more variables with an attempt to explain the cause and effect or causal relationship. Pause the presentation while you determine the answer. Let's return to discuss the answer. So, the descriptive analysis is presented in Table 1. And the explanatory analysis is presented in Table 2. That's because Table 8.1 only tells us, it only describes the characteristics of the population and how we define the family. It doesn't tell us why we define it as such. Table 8.2 on the bottom, on the other hand, this table proposes a potential reason why, or a causal relationship. Individuals who did not have any gay friends or relatives were more likely to conform to exclusionist definitions of the family, meaning only heterosexual and/or legal marriages counted as a family. Also, Table 8.2 presents 2 variables: family definition at the top, exclusionist, moderate, or inclusionist, and also whether or not the respondent had gay friends or relatives over the first column over to the left. So remember when we discussed the types of questions asked in a survey and how you ask questions beyond the research question? This is why. To discover why someone would define a family in a certain way. So we're not only asking them how they define a family, but also other aspects that could influence it, such as, do they have any gay friends or relatives? Let's now look at the variations in survey design. There is a cross-sectional design, which means that the survey is fielded at essentially one point of time, so it's completed once. The other type of survey design are longitudinal designs. This means that the surveys are asked at one or more point in time. And there's 2 types of longitudinal designs. There's the trend study and the panel study. Trend studies ask questions, repeated surveys of independently selected samples of the same population. Panel studies are repeated surveys of the same individuals. So the same individual in the trend study might not participate in a survey from one iteration to the next. In a panel study, it's the same individual that participates in each iteration of the survey. So the panel survey really allows us to permit the study of individuals and their change over time. The trend is more, let me bring up this graph. The trend shows us more how populations changes over time. While the trend and panel have some similarities, the key differences include who is included in the study in each survey and the type of conclusions that you can make from the data. Lastly, let's take a look at the different modes of collecting data. There's the face-to-face interviews, which means that the questionnaires are conducted between the interviewer and the respondent face-to-face. There's telephone interviews. The questionnaire is conducted over the phone with researchers asking questions and describing each of the possible options for response. As you can imagine, both face-to-face and telephone interviewing can be very time-consuming and expensive. They're also quite interactive, meaning there's a high degree of communication. So for complicated survey questionnaires, face-to-face or telephone are ideal. Mail interviews, also, they're also called paper and pencil, is where the questionnaire is mailed to potential respondents. The respondents complete the questionnaire on their own and mail it back to the researchers. Computer-assisted self-interviews are becoming more and more common because of their ease of use. This mode is an electronic survey that is sent to respondents, usually by email, for respondents to complete and submit on their own. There are various advantages and disadvantages to each of these survey modes. While we won't go into detail for them, it's helpful to know why you would choose one mode over another. To review, in this presentation, we had an introduction to survey research using the Constructing a Family study. We discussed the general features of survey research, including large-scale probability sampling, structured interviews and questionnaires, and that it allows for quantitative data analysis. And we also discussed variations in survey design, including cross-sectional and the two types of longitudinal surveys, panel and trend surveys, and the different modes of collecting data. In the next presentation, we'll discuss how to design questions for a survey questionnaire, which will be useful for this week's discussion board assignment.